Okay, thank you for the introduction. So welcome again to the PhD lecture. And in this lecture, I will give a brief introduction how temporal visual data can be analyzed. So why are we interested in temporal data? I think this is relatively straightforward. If you think about data what we collect over time, the plants are growing, so we have measurements and we want to analyze them. So here you have one example. This is like an example of a recording. It's actually about sugar beet. And the sugar beet has been recorded at different times of the year in the year 2019. And this is also an example where the plant suffers from a nutrient deficiency. This is an example where the images are collected directly close to the ground, but also if I have a satellite image remote sensing, also here we have data which has been collected over time. And in principle, it's like the visual data, what we have to analyze means that we have our time, we have a recording, and we actually want to measure a little bit how the plant is growing and want to actually analyze other types of data related to the plant. So before I a little bit describe why visual data tech means just think about you have a set of images which are recorded over time. So they're also a little bit, usually we assume that they're aligned. So technically that each of the plants is roughly at the same location over time. And this can be like RGB images, but we see a little bit later can be also other types of image. And visual data is different to, for instance, like if you do some measurement of traits directly and then want to analyze them. So for instance, if you want to measure the height of the plant or extract other traits like the size of the leaves, in this case, the data is actually in a vector form. And that means like the vector here, you have maybe here different parameters or different traits what have measured, and you could also analyze this kind of the data. So in this introduction, I will talk about visual data, which means we have a set of images, and then we want to analyze them. So we do not extract any traits before. We directly work with the visual data. For visual data, it actually doesn't matter so much channels actually you have. So in the simplest case, you simply have an intensity image, which means for each pixel, you have just like a single value. If you take the images with a standard camera or the smartphone, then we have usually RGB data, which means we have 3 channels per pixel. But we can also have hyperspectral data, which means like we cover a larger range of the wavelengths. And that means like also here, this is a type of visual data. So the only difference is you can have different amount of channels ranging from 1 to actually multiple 1. And whatever algorithm or like ingredients, what I will describe, they can be used for any type of visual data. The important thing is that the data is in a grid structure. Think of a matrix or a tensor where we have pixels and each of the pixels have some kind of values. So to analyze such a data, we need actually 2 ingredients. The first is we need to extract some kind of features from the data, and the second part is actually the temporal modeling. So even probably you have seen some kind of talks before, people talking about of end-to-end learning. You can also do it in principle here, but for video data, we have huge issues regarding memory. So at the end, in most cases, you first extract some features and then you do a temporal modeling on top of it. So to extract features, you do not take the entire sequence, but you take like recordings or images which have been close in time. And then at the end, you also extract kind of a feature vector, which is like not comparable to the vectors what I mentioned before. So not referring to any traits. It's kind of an abstract representation which summarizes the content of a few measurements which are close in time. And the dimensionality is usually quite high. We talk about here 1,000, 2,000 dimensions. And since this capture only like a few neighboring frames, so this feature is extracted. Here we also can have an overlap, and we get actually a set of this kind of the feature vectors for a subset of images. The second part is then when we have extracted this kind of the feature representation, now we want to estimate something over time. So this can be anything like a state of the plant. So for instance, like if there's some disease or not, but it can be also a quantity. So what is, for instance, like the number of fruits the height of the plant, any kind of parameters we want to estimate over time. And for the temporal modeling, we now directly work on the extracted features, which are here indicated by the vectors, and we define kind of a temporal model. So that means like I take my observation at the time, and I want to actually estimate the state. I just say it like in a general, the state of the plan here, W1, which means like the first measurement, and then to make like the prediction for the next timestamp. This is W2. We also take the new observation here and also take into account what was my previous state. And in this kind of the temporal modeling, I actually estimate the state of the plant over time. And I will actually give you a brief introduction what you can actually do for the two ingredients, namely the extracting the features, which is here the red part, and the temporal modeling, which is here the blue part. So let's start regarding the features. I will actually describe two features. The first are dense trajectories, and the other one will be based on learned features. So for the dense trajectories, the good thing is you do not need any expensive learning approach. So what is the high-level idea? If you take images, so plants are also moving. Therefore, you also want to actually extract first trajectories over time. So here's illustrated for like a video. You see the red points. This is like the starting point of a trajectory, and the green is like it's a trajectory over the next 15 frames. So you get like a rough idea what is the motion in this kind of the sequence. So here the person is probably not moving much, but the head here in the front, it actually moves here to the right over the next frames. And this kind of the sampling is actually done usually at multiple resolutions. So you take your images and then you separate you scale your input resolution of your images to lower scales, that at the end you want to have more kind of high level trajectories and more like at a fine level, which is here with the highest resolution. So if you have an example, which is here a nice illustration, just to give a little bit of idea how many trajectories you actually easily get. So this is like a very short clip, only 55 frames over time. And the resolution here is also quite low. I think it's just like VGA or even lower. And already here you get around 15,000 trajectories. The trajectories here indicated by blue, that's not really yet a descriptor. It just gives you an information how actually an object moves over time. And now we actually want to go along each of the trajectory and describe a little bit the appearance of the plant or the appearance of the object in this video. And what you actually do is like you have trajectories. So each of the trajectories in this setup is only like for 15 frames. And now you look at going along here, the blue trajectory, you look at the neighboring pixel in each of the frames. And in this neighborhood, you extract certain kind of information. I will actually show a little bit on the next slide how it looks like, but it's actually indicated here at the bottom. So we have some information about the gradients. So what are edges in the images or regarding the shape, for instance, of the plant. Then we have like the motion histogram of optical flow. That refers a little bit what we see with the trajectory. So where certain parts in the image are moving in the next frame. And the motion boundary histograms, I will illustrate them next, what this information encodes. So this is like an example. So we have a set of images taken over time. We actually compute the so-called optical flow. So optical flow is the same what we used before to compute the trajectories, which means I take a pixel in my frame, for instance, like at the head, and I actually want to know where this pixel moves in the next frame. So I compute some kind of correspondences between two neighboring frames. The color coding here is not that easy a little bit to see because the color here indicates the direction in which kind of the pixel moves, but you can actually recognize there's a different motion. It's a little bit hard to see from the frames, but the camera is also moving. Therefore, we have a motion of the background. We see a little bit where the car is a little bit closer. There's a different color of the car motion, and the person here, which actually leaves the car, also has a different motion. So based on the color, I can actually distinguish the background, the person, and parts of the car. And that's different to the gradients from the images. So the gradients, they indicate if we have a local change in the color value. So we see the black clothing, and here the lake is a bit bright color. Therefore, we get here a relative strong edge. So this actually tells me about information, about shapes, what I have here. I see nicely the person, I see the car, but I also see the tree, which is not visible here in the motion field. And the motion boundaries, that's actually much more interesting than the optical flow. In principle, what you do, you compute derivative in the x direction, that's the horizontal motion boundaries, and in the y direction, which is the vertical motion boundaries. And you see it here between the person and the background. Here you get this kind of edge information, which actually separates the background and the foreground. So that's better to see here in this video. We have here like a video sequence. We see also we have camera motion. On the right top, you see the trajectories. So this kind of the green lines, which are extracted. Here you see the gradient information. So that's just like static for each of the frames computed. You see the lines of the wall. You see the shape of the car. So this gives you kind of the context about the shape, but without any motion. And if you look at the optical flow, it's very coarse. You can also have more expensive algorithms, which take more time, which are more accurate, but at the end, in this setup, in most cases, to have some kind of a relative cheap optical flow is actually good enough. So we see actually here, roughly the idea where the persons are, the opening of the door, and also later, some kind of the structure of the car. But this kind of information is actually better visible here at the motion boundary histograms, because here you see the change of the motion in the x-y direction and in the y direction. You see here very good the person moving around, and also like when the person enters the car. But you don't see the difference here, the texture information, that's not part of it, because at the end here, the motion of the entire wall goes in the same direction. So that is one way how you can describe motion, which is based on trajectories. If you have enough training data, which also has done some kind of annotation, whatever kind of different states or what kind of plans you have in the sequence, you can also use 3D convolutional neural networks to learn a feature representation. So as similar to like 2D convolutions, you can also have 3D convolutions in the 3D space. What you do is like you have your sequence of images, you stack them together. So this is like the long direction is the time axis. You have the X and the Y direction, and the convolution kernel, which is here orange, you do kind of a weighted sum of the values of your stacked frames, weighted by the values what you learn in your 3D convolution, and that gives you an updated value, which is here indicated by the red color. And you can apply a different set of 3D convolutions after each other, and this gives you a representation. And finally, you reorder this kind of the pixel values into a vector format. So similar like 2D convolution networks, you can also do the same with 3D convolutions. So we start with 3D convolutions. The number here, 64, that indicates that you learn 64 different convolution currents in parallel. You can also have so-called pooling layers, which technically does a reduction, usually in the spatial domain, by simply taking the maximum of a neighborhood of pixels. And you have a set of convolutions. And at the end here, fully connected layer, which means like here you convert the feature maps into a vector format. However, just naively applying 3D convolution to stacked frames doesn't work very well. So this is kind of the first approaches to actually use 3D convolution networks. So this is just like one data set, even it's here for actual recognition. Similar results you would also get from other data sets if they're from agriculture. And you see actually if you use these dense trajectories, you get actually a higher recognition accuracy compared to the 3D CNN. And the thing is like, unfortunately, if you want to get a better result, you still need to compute the optical flow. So here you see different kind of structures from A to E, how you can actually design your 3D CNN or like a combination of 2D CNNs. And I just want to highlight two. So the variant B, that's what we have seen before. You stack all the frames, all the images what you have, and then technically you apply a 3D convolution networks with different letter, and that actually makes them a prediction of some class probabilities. So the class probabilities here is just like an example for training, but it could be also like a set of state what you actually want to predict. That's what we've seen doesn't work so very well. What is actually done in practice is the variant E, where you have so-called a two-stream 3D convolution network. And that technically means like you have not only stacked the images, but you also stack the frames of optical flow. And at the end, you have two 3D convolution networks, which have different kernels, but at the end the structure is the same. And then you simply average. This plus means like you average the prediction, and this gives you much better results, because at the end here, you still have what we have seen with the dense trajectories, giving an idea in which kind of direction each of the pixels or how the plant actually moves over time. I want to, however, highlight one aspect. Whatever structure you take, you're very limited to the input. So here you see that it only takes 64 frames. If you have dense measurements over time, this might be not enough. And the 64 frames, there is actually a very simple limit, and that's the memory on your GPU. So training this kind of the models is also very expensive. And usually in most cases, you take like 3D CNNs, which takes maybe like 32 or 16 frames as the input. And 64 is already kind of the maximum what I can train just based off the memory. So even you have 3D CNNs, which actually model already spatial temporal information, they are not good enough to model like long-term relations. So for instance, like I do the recording of a year, with more than 64 measurements, then you cannot use a 3D CNN to analyze everything. And therefore, we need a second ingredient, and that's the temporal model. So I will also give a brief introduction of 4 different models what you can use. A very simple approach is you simply take a 3D CNN in a sliding window. So let's say we have like training for 64 frames. We actually go over the time of the sequence, and then we can predict here maybe different states. So maybe green means the plant is healthy, blue means a little bit critical, and maybe red, that's like the time when it's ready for harvest. And the sliding window, however, is not very flexible, because at the end we train it, for instance, like only for 64 frames. But now we have maybe want to model like longer context, then we have one problem, we are not flexible enough. We would actually need to retrain everything, and we can only have a fixed temporal window. If you would have multiple sizes of the window, then things becomes very expensive. So the temporal sliding window is something what I can do as a starting point, but it's not a good model. Another model for temporal modeling are hidden Markov models. So they actually have been heavily used partly in the past, and they're very nice because they're relatively simple. So they actually model the relation of the state of the plant over time, and also relation of the observation what I have and what my current state actually should be. And the nice thing of hidden Markov models is I can write the joint probability of my observations. So this is like the feature vectors, what I've extracted from my images. And W, that's more or less the states what I want to estimate. And I can actually model the joint probability of my observations and my states by small probabilities. Small, I mean, actually they depend only on a subset of the parameters, because on the one end, I have the probabilities, which tells me if I know the state at my frame of my plant, it tells me what is the probability that the observation, what I see in my image, actually corresponds to my state. So this is also known as the likelihood. And the second probability, this tells me if I know my state in my previous frame, let's say the frame 2, what is the probability in my next state? And here I can encode some kind of knowledge what I have about my problem. So let's say the state of the plant, some transition might be not possible. And also I can also given, I know my state, so what is the probability that it stays in the same state, or what is the probability that it changes the state? And the nice thing of the hidden Markov models, I will come to it a little bit later, but technically the first term is also called then how likely is your measurement and your plant state. So W is a plant state, and how it actually fits to the measurement what you observe. And the second term, that's like, what is the consistency between the state at the previous frame n-1 and the state at the current frame. And the nice thing is, like for hidden Markov model, I can nicely optimize because I know X, my observations, but I don't know W1. So now I have my full probability, and I would like to know, well, what would be for my given observations, what would be my state of my plant over time? And that means we're looking for the maximum, or better to say the argmax of this probability. So what is the maximum or the argmax of all my states over time that this probability is maximized? And you can also write it by taking the minimum, just adding the minus. And now we do what we do all the time. We apply the logarithm, because the logarithm makes things easier for the optimization. If I apply the logarithm to a product of probabilities, I can rewrite everything as the sum. And optimizing our sum of terms is much easier than optimizing our the product of terms. So I can now briefly rewrite the two terms. So the first I call the unary term. Unary term means that this term depends only on my single frame n. So here it only depends on the state at my frame n. And the second part here that I write as my binary terms, because here it depends on the states of two neighboring frames, n and n-1. And if I have such kind of an energy function, the good thing is I can actually solve it by dynamic programming. So I'm not going into detail, but the nice thing of hidden Markov models, if I have such a model and I have a reasonable estimate of these two probabilities, I can actually solve and get the global optimum of all the states given my observation. So that's why hidden Markov models are very useful, but they have some limitation because we only model the relation of the state based to the previous state. But sometimes if we might have more complex relations over time, that my state at the frame n might also depend on the previous states, which have been maybe like 5, 10, or 20 measurements before. So another way how to do the temporal modeling are so-called recurrent neural networks. In this way, I'm a little bit more flexible what I actually handle because I actually learn the temporal model. So recurrent neural networks are actually relatively straightforward, similar to standard networks. I have my input. Here, W, that's kind of parameters what I learn, which actually typically apply, for instance, like this matrix to my input, or it can be also like a convolution, and I get an update. And recurrent means that at the end, I take my output of this layer, apply it with the matrix W, which I also learn, and then feed it back to the same layer. For temporal modeling, it's actually better to look at recurrent neural networks if we actually unroll the network, which means we have a sequence over time. X1 to X2 are my measurements. W1, that's my learned parameters, which actually map my input to the feature space. Here, A1, this corresponds to a nonlinear function, which can be tangent hyperbolicus or anything else. And then I have another kind of output, a matrix, which also is learned, apply to it, and this gives me the prediction of the state at my current frame. And here, that's the way where I propagate the information from the previous frame by the learned matrix W to the next frame. And then I can actually make the output for the state of the plant for each of my frames. RNNs, however, have one big problem, because at the end, again, if I want to model the state of the plant at the frame t+1 based on some observation, which was like some time ago, then the RNN is not able to handle this kind of long relations. That's very straightforward if you go a little bit back, because at the end, I learned just like a fixed matrix, and either these values are very high, which means like I strongly rely on my previous state, but the input of my new observation has low impact, or I have it the other way around. My W1 matrix has high values, then the state at my current frame mainly depends on my new observation, and it depends only a little bit on my previous features. And that's the problem, is that technically my RNN in the naive implementation I cannot really handle the relation between my past and my future. And this has been addressed by so-called gated units. So what are actually gates? In principle, is like what we want to do. We want to control the information flow within a recurrent neural network. So this is like a naive neural network, RNN. So we have my observation, xt. I get the information from a previous RNN cell from the previous frame. I combine this information, have a nonlinear function like a tangent hyperbolicus, and then actually update the state of my plan and so on. And that does not work very well because at the end, depending on how I combine the information, I either rely on the past information or I mainly rely on the current information. And with gates, we can actually control the information flow. So the high-level idea of a gate is if I have a value and I multiply it with 0, I delete it, right? I have my information, I multiply with 0, everything is deleted. If I multiply it with the value of 1, I keep it as it is. And I can actually use with gates, which are functions which generate values between 0 and 1. And I can use it to, for instance, delete my past, but I can also use it to skip my new observation because maybe it's not really relevant and I do not observe anything new. And these gates are modeled by so-called segment functions, which is, if you look technically, if the input z is 0, then I have a value of 0.5. If z is negative, then it's actually close to 0. And if z is positive, then the value is close to 1. And formally, it's just like 1 over 1 plus the exponential minus the input. But here you see also the nice shape where we get values between 0 and 1. So now how are the gates actually used within a recurrent neural network? There are different kinds of variants. I just want to briefly a little bit describe the high-level idea for a gated recurrent unit. So this actually uses gates. So the sigma here, that's the sigma function, what I see in this kind of the cell. And I just want to focus only on one part, is actually the last line here in the equations. So ht minus 1, that's what I have from my previous frame. So that's my representation. And h tilde, this is actually computed from my new observation xt. And now I want to actually do kind of a combination of my previous information and my new information. And this updates the state of my cell. And z here, that's from a gate. So at the end, this controls how I interpolate the information of the past and my new observation. So one case, my gate z is 1. In this case, I only take my new observation, but I do not take the information from the previous observation. The other case, if my gate is actually 0, it's closed, I skip my new information because in h tilde, I have my new observation, but I don't use this information because I multiplied with 0. I only take the information from the previous frame. And therefore, that's a way how, for instance, like I can skip my current informations. And that actually helps. If I skip current information, I actually can store or memorize the old informations better. So if get information which is not relevant, I can simply skip it. There are also other forms of gated units. Another example are long short-term memory cells, which are a little bit more complex, but they can be also used. You can actually also combine them. So for instance, you can also, if this is your features, what they actually get. So this is your input sequence of frames. Here actually we extract with a 3D CNN certain kind of the feature vectors. Then we have an RNN. Here we use gated recurrent units. They give me already kind of probabilities of the states of the plant. And on top of it, I can still have a hidden Markov model to make then a more robust prediction. And this kind of the combination actually often helps, and you get often much better results. I just want to briefly describe the last temporal model, what I want to discuss, and that's our temporal convolution networks. And the reason what we have them in the order, so sliding window is nearly no temporal modeling. Hidden Markov model has some kind of temporal modeling, but we make some strong assumption that if I know my previous state, it encodes all information of what happened before. Recurrent neural network I can train, but I have to add some kind of gates in that at the end I can actually learn some temporal relation, but they're still limited both what is the temporal context what I can handle. And the temporal convolution, they actually are able to handle a very large context. So if I take the recording over time and I want to actually have model some relations, what happened at the beginning and very late in the season, I probably should use temporal convolution networks. So what is the basic idea of a temporal convolution network? So they also have been used, for instance, like for analyzing audio data. So we see that's my input. Then I have different layers. In each of the layers, I also have a convolution, but this is only one-dimensional. So see for the illustration, so I have my blue dots. Again, I compute a weighted combination of the values to update the value for the next layer. And what you see, the distance between the arrows, the input is getting larger. So here, that's the term delayed. Here I skip, take only every second one. Here I take in the next layer 1 out of 4. And here in the top layer, I take 1 out of 8. And that means if I want to have an update at this frame, I take the information, if you look, the black arrows from the entire input or nearly the entire input. And in this way, by increasing kind of the dilation factor of the convolutions in the layers, I get a very long receptive field, which means if I make a prediction at my observation here, I take also observation into account which have been far in the past. And this can be also applied to visual data. So what you actually do is like you have your sequence, then you take usually a 3D CNN, to extract the feature vectors, which are here indicated by the blue dots. And then we also have delayed vectors. Here we start with a convolution, kernel size 3, which means we have 3 gray dots and compute like the weighted values of the 3 dots, which gives me the update for the next layer. If we then continue, now I only take every second input, only every 1 out of 4, and here 1 out of 8. And it means if I have a prediction here, I also have a very large temporal receptive field, which means like the information, what I use to compute this orange value is now based maybe on my entire recording over time. And you can even want to, if you want to make it larger, you can actually stack this kind of the modules where you actually start with your dilation factor setting to 1. So we have here from the first module, so we have factor 1, 1 out of 2, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 8. And then we restart. We start taking everyone, 1 out of 2, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 8. And in this way, I can actually have a very powerful model which analyze my input visual data, and I can actually take into account a very long temporal context. So to summarize, if you want to analyze visual data, you mainly need 2 ingredients. The first is exactly the features, which can be a dense trajectory. So here you do not need much training data, and partly you do not need any label data, but it can also have 3D CNNs. And what I did not discuss, you can also use vision transformers, but they are also very expensive. So at the end, also very limited in the number of input frames what I can use. Therefore, you need a temporal model, which can be a hidden Markov model or recurrent neural network or a temporal convolution network. And in most cases, you can also combine them. So for instance, a hidden Markov model with an RNN. You can also combine temporal convolution networks, for instance, like with transformers. All the combinations are possible. So this is the end of this brief lecture. I just gave a high-level introduction, and now we have time for some questions.